You ready? Thank you very much for coming and for having me. All the Livelong Day, the Thanksgiving Woodstock by Richard Neal. It's an honor to be doing this, and it was an honor to write the book, and mainly because of the era of writing about that time and the people. There seemed to be, as I wrote it, I didn't realize that going in, but as I started to do it, I said, it's the time and the people, the integrity that they seem to have. Of course, that might have just been through youthful eyes. I don't know, but it just seemed like in those days people had a toughness and a tenacity, and and so I'm going to go into it a little bit. I'm going to go into it in three parts, mainly that. Start here to first to talk a little bit about me and how the book happened to come about, which is kind of an interesting story. I think if you'll indulge me, if that's the right use of the word, about that. But first, my brother Robert Gambrell here is here. Now he is a historian and a railroad expert. So, so, uh, and I surprisingly did not refer to him a whole lot, but toward the end I did. He pointed out a couple of things that I needed to do on my accuracy of what was going on at that time, especially with railroads and things like that. And Jan Winston is a very good friend of mine. We go back to the third grade, and she worked with Corey Watson attorneys in Birmingham, and she broke my heart in the eighth grade at the Comer School swing. So if you ever had that happen to you, you know how rough it can be. But so we waited about 60 years to decide, well, let's pick up where we left off. Hey, let's see if it works better from here on out. It can't be worse. But anyway, no, but it's been very good. And I appreciate you coming, and I appreciate it, brother, and all of you. I know Gary is the only one that did that before a little bit, and I found out that he wrote numerous books at a obviously youthful age, and it was something I always wanted to do. I'm going to kind of just stay where we are, if you were just a second, and I'll kind of just get into the slides. I'm going to do it in three parts. First about me, then about the wreck itself, and then about a little bit how the book leads into it. And I don't want to go into like the end of the book, because if any of you do read it, and there's some things there which I never really saw it that apparently creates some suspense and drama and things like that, which I didn't even realize that. I did know that a couple of times I said, well, it might be best not to say this now and later. But anyway, the slide before said that my father came home at the end of the war, World War II, and went to work shoveling coal on the railroad. And of course, in a few years, steam locomotives went out, and his life became easier, as I imagine it did for a lot of people that work furnaces. And I think with mechanization, one thing, I'm sure it made it easier. And I know it did for him and people who shoveled coal and trains. The steam locomotives were like dinosaurs; they kind of disappeared. And in any case, in my case, so I'm kind of thrust into a role here of writing this book. I always wanted to write a book, and so and Lord Byron was kind of my hero, even though I can't tell you one thing that he wrote. But so time came along, and I'll tell you a little bit and try to make this as fast as possible, not to bore you. But in 1960 something, a friend of mine came by my house and said, let's go for a walk. And I asked him where we're going, and he didn't tell me. He said, just come on, you're going to like this. And so we walked down went to a friend of mine, another friend that I just met, had never met her before. Her name was Vicki Marsh. She lived across the highway from where I lived, and actually where Jan lived as well. And so we met then, and then a few years later we're at Woodlawn High School, and where my grandparents lived right across from Woodlawn Stadium on 55th Street. and that's in the book. And so a few years later, we were in a class at Woodlawn under the Woodlawn Stadium. If you remember Woodlawn Stadium, it had I think about 4,000 or 5,000 seat stadium beside the school, which was kind of unusual. Just one went up like this, you know. But if you never went there, you didn't realize that underneath there you had classrooms going this way. And so we're sitting there in the 10th grade English class with really good friends, myself and Vicki Marsh. And an English teacher said, I was a BC student, was not all that great a student, but somehow when I wrote papers and all that, it seemed to take on a better light. And the teachers were all of a sudden want to talk to me about something else other than being in trouble, you know. So we're sitting in the English class and we did a paper and come back and the English teacher says I gave 1A and 1A plus, and I said, and somehow I knew, I don't know why, because I thought my paper was pretty good, and I usually get an occasion on papers I did. And then she said, and sure enough, I got the A, and Vicki got the A plus. And her brother, I said, well, I thought to myself it was her brother that did it, Randy Marsh, and he went on to, he was a teacher at the Alabama School of Fine Arts, and went on to help form the Birmingham Festival Theater. He was a thespian or such, or used to like to write plays. And then Vicki and I went to the school together beyond that, and then in the 80s, her and her husband, Dennis Covington, we kind of lost touch with each other after high school, or right after that. And but her and her husband, she married Dennis Covington, and also went to Woodlawn, a little bit older than us. And Dennis became a real good writer. He also was the head of the creative writing department at UAB, and Vicki taught creative writing there. And in the 80s and 90s, if you remember, she and Dennis wrote a book called Salvation on Sand Mountain. If you have a chance to read a book, that would be the one I would recommend, one of my favorites. And it's just written really well, and they were very, very good. They worked on each other's work and called it working in each other's garden. You need an editor, and that's basically what they were doing, was editing each other's work. So I was real kind of jealous, you know. I said, well, I could really show her if I had a chance. But you know, I was trying to make a living. And time went by, and the things changed, and books kind of fell. When the computer came along, as we know, the traditional publishing houses, a lot of them imploded and disappeared, kind of like the steam locomotives. But about 2005, I was coming back from a job in Boise, Idaho, and I was a forester. And I came back, and there's a good bit in the book about flora and things, not too much, but some people have commented on that. So in 2005 or 6, I wrote a book called Serenade. It was the first one I wrote. And when I first wrote it out, it came out real fast and wrote it very quickly, unlike this book. And I called Vicki. I didn't really even know she was teaching creative writing at the time, but I called her. And I knew she'd written all those books and essays and newspaper articles. And I said, well, called her up and said, well, would you look at this or whatever? And she allowed me to send it to her, and then we had set up some sessions, and she edited it for me. And it got some good response. It didn't catch on very well, but it did with read a college class or two, which I thought never dreamed that would ever happen. But so we helped there. But about 2006, we're sitting out by our house on Cullum Street in Birmingham, and she hears a train whistle below. And she asked me, she says, you know, where's that train running? You know, and I said, well, I wasn't really sure. Had my brother been there, he would have probably known exactly where it was. And it was over towards Green Springs, I think, because the trains go west of town a little bit from the terminal station, the old terminal station, and go to 14th Street, and they split, and the L&N went down toward Montgomery, and the old AGS, which is what runs out here, was once called the Alabama Great Southern Railroad, and the smaller railroad. And then they went into a conglomerate the Southern Railway system. And I told her, well, it's going out that direction, and it's probably the L&N. And then I said, well, my father worked for the railroad, and my mother did too. This book, as Vicki says, it was a man's world in those days, but in this book, the women are well represented and described. And so we were talking on, and she says, and I said, well, my mother always wanted to write a book. She worked for the union later. She knew the railroad people as well as my father did. She knew, with their problems because there was a grievance committee she worked for that, and they took on the problems that people got in trouble and got fired from the railroad. And her father had actually worked at Norris Yard out here, inspecting train cars and that type of thing. And they lived right there in Woodlawn. And so flash forward a little bit again, and I said, well, she said, well, you ought to write a book about that train wreck. I told her about the train wreck, and she said, you ought to write a book about that. It's like 2007 or 8, and 2007. And then I said, well, that would be a good idea, I suppose. But I gave it some thought, but never really seriously, because I doubted there was enough information there. Maybe it might be a better short story than it would be a book. And but then in 2007, I was going out on Amtrak out of downtown on Morris Avenue. Walked in. I'm not really a gabby person in situations like that, but I looked at the station master there who was getting my tickets ready to go on the trip. It said December 2007. And I told him, I said, but I did know that some people remembered my father. I said, my father worked for the railroad. And I said, next thing I said was, he was on that wreck at Woodstock. I don't know why. And I really wasn't thinking about the book so much, or even really seriously considered it. The first thing he says is, I have transcripts to that wreck. And well, I still didn't come in my head. I thought, so that's good. And he said, if you'd like to read them, come back from your trip, and I'll put you in a little room and you can read transcripts. And I said, well, I'll do that. So 3 or 4 months, it was a long trip. 3 or 4 months later, I came back down there on Morris Avenue, went to the little room, and he set me up. And I made notes and write things out and about the wreck and everything. I lost the notes, and I never really pursued it anymore. But several years later, for whatever reason, about 2011, I suppose, I don't know, but I started thinking about it more. I went back and told him, said, look, you let me read the transcripts of National Transportation Safety Board and of the hearings that were actually ICC. And I said, well, would you let me make a copy of those transcripts? And he said, sure would. Let me go in there. He said, you bring them back to me in good form. So I made transcripts. And I kept reading them, and I thought they're really interesting, really strange to read some of those things that people said about the wreck and everything. But it still light didn't come on. A few years later, just about 2018 or 19, I started trying to write it. Sent a bunch of it to Vicki to see if she wanted to look at it and edit and everything. And she didn't really, somehow or another, she never got them. And I also took them another year or two. At the time, I was working summers for the Forest Service, or Bureau of Land Management, in California mostly, during fire season. There's an old fire guide, and that's where the book actually begins. But, so I started writing it there, and then she came along, and really, I guess for that whole spiel, things just seemed to happen, and it for me, and so it made it really work out. And the feedback so far has been really well as far as some things there. Can you go back just one? And one of the things I wanted to show here was, thank you. The creative nonfiction part. The book is historical because of those transcripts. Anything that is said about the wreck is true. Anything, but what it tries to do in creative nonfiction, a lot of people say that's creative nonfiction is based on a true story, like you see a movie that's based on a true story. That's a loose definition, and that's true. It is based on a true story. But if it's based on a true story, the endings could be totally different. The people that got killed might, the bank robbers that and doing a bank robber movie or whatever is based on a true story, but they may ride off in the sunset, but actually they got killed. So but in this case, it is true what happened with regard to the wreck, but it tries to tie the human equation and the people and what went on in their lives in a situation like this, because it was very. So like I say, I would think it was very traumatic. But anyway, and then there's talk here of suspense and everything. I didn't see that, and you can go forward now, Gary, if you would. Thank you. And does anybody know anything about? Has ever heard of this wreck at all? Or did anybody?
Actually, what time?
November the 25th, 1951.
Okay.
And
for some reason it sounds vaguely
familiar.
Woodstock is Woodstock.
Woodstock between Birmingham and Tuscaloosa. That's correct. Yes. Thank you. Anytime anybody want to say anything ever ask, please do. Yeah. And growing up, my brother and I, there was some discussion of the wreck, excuse me, but most of it was not all that serious. It was for some reason, after you go through something like that, it's kind of like people that have been in war, I guess. A lot of times you say, well, my father was in the war, but he never taught, he started back coming to the war. My father was a Marine on the Iwo Jima, but he never talked about that in serious terms that I ever heard. And a little bit I'd asked, but you'd be kind of skimmed over. He never mentioned the wreck more than it's kind of a very lackadaisical, which is kind of strange, but in any case, it was. One thing I learned when I started doing this, and one of the main themes of the book is that when a story is told mouth to mouth through the years, it seems to change. I went down to Woodstock and, I started looking online, talking to people down there a little bit when I started writing the book. And all the stories I heard about the wreck, and I would say, is that right? And then if that's not exactly the way I heard it, did I hear it right or did they hear it right? A lot of things were different. But when I got those transcripts from Mr. Hasty at the Amtrak in 2007, that allowed to know what happened. Not because a lot of things I just knew right. And an example of that would be, this was written Thanksgiving Day. It's even there, it says Thanksgiving Day. And there's been things written that things said like it was not Thanksgiving Day, it was Thanksgiving weekend. It was the Sunday after Thanksgiving. But that's just an example of what it goes into the book that when you tell a story. When I was in school, we'll get moving with these faster in a minute. I'm going to just kind of, in school, we had a thing one time that was 10 people went out of the room. And then they did some kind of activity. Somebody slapped somebody, pulled the chair out from under them, whatever it was. And then and all the classes up here watching. And then as one by one, you have one person witness it. One by one, a person comes back in, and that person that was witnessing it tells the first person that comes back in, who tells the second person that comes back in, and then the third person comes back in. It gets down to number 10. By the time you get to number 10, you can't tell what happened at all. The story, I imagine lawyers run into this all the time. I mean, and this was, people, and we were just roaring laughter watching it, because by the time it got to number 10, it wasn't even the same action anymore. So again, the transcripts, the people under oath giving their story of what happened is what allowed a whole lot of factual nature that wouldn't have been there. It became nonfiction at that point. 17 was the eventual number. What it goes into a little bit in the book is the difficulty with getting information from Woodstock to the world about what happened. Didn't have cell phones. Somebody mentions in their testimony that they had to drive down to the phone booth to make a call. So no one knew what happened, especially my mother, who was in Woodlawn with my brothers, and they set out that night to go to Woodstock to basically find out what happened. What they ran into was a mass of cars where people had come out to see the wreck, and it just was it's a very difficult situation. Alicia. Okay, there's a little bit of the damage there, or a lot of it. This would be they run the train now, it's called the Crescent. Runs, over toward Atlanta, goes to Tuscaloosa the other way. Doesn't come up the old AGS toward Chattanooga, of course. But in those days, it was called the Southerner, basically. But what happened was the Crescent at that time ran from Atlanta down to West Point, Georgia, to Montgomery, and then on down to New Orleans. And the Southerner ran what the Crescent runs today, which is New Orleans to New York, coming through Birmingham and Tuscaloosa and Atlanta. But there was a washout of the rails between West Point and Montgomery, I believe. But it was on that route that the Crescent was supposed to take. So the Crescent came through Birmingham, and where the Southerner was, the trains were running normally, the Southerner fell in behind. They put it behind the first train, the Southerner. The first train was called 47. This train was called Second 47. They're running one right behind the other, headed from here to Tuscaloosa to Meridian to New Orleans. Of course, the northbound's coming up. It left New Orleans that morning at 7 o'clock, and it's coming up, and it comes through Tuscaloosa, heads for Birmingham. And when they get there at Woodstock, they're supposed to pass. If you've ever ridden a train, you're riding along, and then you'll feel the train pull over into a sidetrack. And you say, well, you'll sit there for a while, and they'll say, why are we sitting here, And then all of a sudden you'll see a train goes whizzing by you. And that's why we were sitting there, was to wait and let that train pass by, And so this day you have the northbound coming, and what the book tries to do is follow what's going on with the northbound as it goes through the day, and then the southbound's coming down, regular southbound with the Southerners. They're supposed to pass, but there's a train right behind the first Southern. So there's 47 and what they call Second 47. My father and that crew was Second 47. And of course, first 47 went through okay and passed 48 coming north, the sister train 48, but Second 47 and 48 collided on the north switch of Woodstock. Yes. Give you a little idea of there's mention in the transcripts and testimonies of a trestle. This was an old mining trestle rail, I believe, that the L&N ran. It runs below the AGS there and crosses underneath. And as you can see, here's the engine on the northbound back over there. And the trains, as they hit, they fell into the trestle. This is the southbound train. This is my father's train. Okay. And my take on this, every time I see this photo, no matter how many times, these photos go back there as old as we are. And my brother and I, somebody showed me Birmingham News. I have the old black and white little, photos used to look, kind of strange looking photos compared to what we do now. But that is the northbound 48 train that my father's train went into. And they say that this engine is in the North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer, North Carolina, which also had a bad wreck up there at one point. But my take on this every time I look at it is, how could anybody live through that period? I mean, that's a lot of force. But yes.
Was it on the trestle? I was looking at that picture before, and there's train trunks, and the trains up high on the trees.
Well, yeah, the train crosses over. There's an underpass there with the trestles here, and then there's a little underpass which was L&N operated, I believe, going underneath. That's not, correct me on anything that's not.
I was trying to decide if it was up on the trestle.
Yeah, it's looking. If you go down there, that underpass is still there now. My brother and I have been down there several times, and it passes underneath there. It's not a rail there anymore. There are some rails there that split off, abandoned old rails that split off and went toward West Blockton and Blockton. And I would imagine that L&N track went that way. And it goes back to the north there, so I guess it's going up towards Brookwood or something like that. It's a guess. I don't really know on that. But yeah, it's up off the ground a bit in that other photo. And the trestle in the book, they mentioned that several times. And it's still kind of the same layout now. It's just underneath there with the old rail.
See, in that picture, it's up at the top of the trees.
Right, yes, yes. Yeah, well, it just kind of, the bed, the railroad bed is up high and it just drops off. And right here was crossing under the tracks was the L&N, a little mining rail that they just used for mining purposes. The main line is running left to right up on an elevated. Woodstock itself is back to the south, would be back to the southwest from there a little bit. Yeah, yes, and there was a little train station there now, not anymore. If you go down to Woodstock, there's couldn't in the old part of Woodstock down by the tracks, there's probably not a whole lot changed. It doesn't seem like it. Most of Woodstock's growth is up toward Caffey Junction, you know. Just the I don't really know what to say about that one too much. I think that is I think it's the southbound too. But I'm not positive which one that is. But there was a lot of people that came out that night. When that exactly was taken there, I don't know. I don't know how much to say about that one other than it was with the group of pictures. Bobby, anything? Robert?
I wonder if they were riders. You know, they appear to be well dressed like.
Oh, yeah.
Traveling.
But there's some discussion of that, you know, where railroads in those days were, you know, it was top dog type stuff, you know, and there's some discussion in the book, which I'll get to in just a second as we start building the book real quick. And this starts moving on quickly if you're getting bored. I don't want to bore your people to death. And I got to go see Alabama play football. Yeah, that's where everybody is right now, watching Georgia and Mississippi State. You know, you got to have priorities in life.
We got 6:30 for Alabama.
Yeah, you got that. It's funny, you know. I mentioned to you the Leeds thing. You know, been trying to we're gonna do a thing over there next week at the old depot, and there were really nice people, Mr. Lowry, and of course Marvin Clemens, who you all probably know, and everything. But that was a big thing for next week. Is they like to do theirs at 2:30 in the afternoon. That's the first thing that went through my mind. 2:30 in the afternoon in the five. You know.
The Alabama game was on, it would be showing on the screen.
Gotcha. And there's mentioned in the book that with my father, how big and everything and about, and as a child, it's some things that were, you know, riding football specials. They used to run specials to a bowl game. And I got to ride a lot of trains as a kid. I don't know a lot about them exactly, but rode a bunch of them. And even as an adult, rode a lot, which were in there a bit. And I think, yeah, this is the last one of the photos of the wreck itself. I'm not sure. I think it's on the end of 48. It could be 47. I'm not sure. I guess it just means they're loading up people. WVRC did a thing about this wreck 2 or 3 years ago. And I've talked to so many people about this wreck. I've had people, a man called me from Woodstock. I've had letters and everything from all over and everything, but he was the only person I've had so far that's been unhappy or I didn't really like the book. And he was in the closest house, his parents, and they ran the store there in Woodstock. And he was in there, but his kind of thing that he didn't like about the book was that I didn't go there and take opinions from the people of Woodstock on what they thought about the wreck. And I said, well, that was not what this book was. I said it'd be a great idea for a book on something like this, you know, but I wouldn't have been the one to try to do that. And he was a little bit, but we're friends now. He's happy again. But he was in the closest house to the wreck, but he was only 2 weeks old. So I kind of thought, well, I have the transcripts. I'm gonna go with the transcripts over your opinion. And there's a man wrote a letter that got on in Hattiesburg, and lives in Arlington now, which is also on the same train route, if you will. And he was about 3 years old. He said he didn't remember much, but he remembered going to some houses with his dad, and they were on the northbound coming up. I had a man, which is probably one of the most meaningful, just personal things, write a really nice letter. About how much he liked it and everything. It turned out he's now the current engineer of the California Zephyr for Amtrak between Emeryville, California. It goes all the way to Chicago, but I guess they changed crews, I think, in Truckee, I believe. And I used to think it was Reno, but I believe my brother corrected me and told me Truckee, but California. But anyway, he wrote a really nice letter about it and about some of the things in the book. This was the worst train wreck in modern history, which in my definition is in Alabama. I consider modern being the 20th century and all, but then that changed with the Sunset Limited in 1992, which you probably remember went into Mobile Bay, and it was much worse. And of course, there was one back on the Cahaba River that's been talked about lately. It's been strange. I've been seeing some articles by some historians all about that train wreck. And it was actually worse. But if you consider modern day 20th century on, this was the worst train wreck until the Sunset Limited. Yeah. And but the letters that I received have just been really good. And a man named Jim Oakley out of Bibb County, he was head of the communications department at Alabama, and was a state legislator from Bibb County for years. I actually worked at Centerville and for the Forest Service at Centerville and lived in West Blockton for a while. But he wrote, I didn't know him, but he did wrote, his daughter gave him the book. He wrote a really nice letter and donated it to the Bibb County Library with his name, with myself as the author. It's big time meaningful, you know, it means a whole lot to me personally. So anyway, beyond that, back to the wreck again, Fletcher. Back to the nonfiction things, the work, this is from the copyright page at the beginning. It's the work of nonfiction, but observation and memory are indeed imperfect. And everything from it's the Thanksgiving Day wreck when it was actually Sunday. There's all kinds of things that if you get around Woodstock and all, that people's pass word to word, you know, from my uncle told my father, that told my, you know, mother told, you know, that she told me that this happened. But back to the thing again, that when you're telling something word to word, the truth gets lost. There's a river in Northern California where I work. It's in the book here. It's the beginning of the book. When I start out in the fire tower of all places, and that's where the book kind of begins. And it talks about there's a river there called the Eel River, and they caught a lamprey, I believe is what you call it, a jawless fish. The old settlers did 150 years ago or whatever. And the fish was a jawless fish, and they thought it was eel, so they named it Eel River. You still Eel River today. They didn't catch the eels. They were catching a fish that didn't have any jaws. Which is how, you know, so the transcripts saved all that for me and made it all possible. So, and the man at Amtrak just happened to mention that. Someone told me one time, you're trying to write a book, if it works, then things are just going to happen. They seem to have. I'm going to go real fast here. This doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Eddie Gulch is where the book begins. Each morning, my job begins by climbing to an elevation of 6,400 feet or thereabout. Eddie Gulch is a fire tower in Northern California, close to Etna and close to Wairika, almost in Oregon. And I worked several years there in different places in California. But that was the one that came here. And one fellow asked me, he wrote me an email, and I had actually met him at lunch one day, and he said, I was real interested to see how you we're going to tie the fire towers into the book. And so I hope that it did. If you read it, that's a judgment you have to make for yourself. If you read it or have read it, and then please just read that for you. Second book is there. That's the same. Yeah. The Never Speak Harsh Words is the start of the second chapter, which begins to where my brother and I starts on the morning of November 25th, 1951. My father getting up going to work. He gets up at 4:10. He ended up not having call time for his train till like 1:40. But he was a military guy, Marine, and I don't know, myself not being a military person, that somehow or another, the military people to me seem like they like to be punctual. So he would get up early. So he gets up early and would all have everything ready way ahead of time, and didn't leave things to chance, get it all set out. I took that to be his military backing. And railroad men, if you had any of them or knew any, they always had a watch, which is a big deal here, a pocket watch, the railroad watch that you look at. And my grandfather had one working at it in our yard. My father on trains, and just about every railroad guy was around. And I didn't realize how big time was for railroad keeping time is to our time zones we have today. But it's somehow or another complicated for me. Not a part of the book, but as a sidelight, that's how the time they used a lot. Railroads required a lot of that. And someone else can explain a lot better than me, but they were tied together. The Hamiltons, the watch everybody kept, beautiful watches. I still wish I had my father's or my grandfather's, and I don't know what happened there. But it's a big thing about that. And every time at the beginning here, every time one of them looks at their Hamilton, it'll switch to the northbound 48 coming up through Mississippi out of New Orleans. New Orleans, in those days, the Southern started right there in the French Quarter. So the train came out of the French Quarter, headed up to Slidell and Picayune, and goes through. It kind of carries you that just a little bits and pieces as he looks at his railroad watch. And but never speak harsh words. They're a married couple getting ready, and we used to kind of. That's actually from a song at the end. It kind of explains it. The wreck of old 97, which you probably heard Johnny Cash sing, or you heard, you probably hadn't, but Johnny Cash, Andy Griffith, and a bunch of people you probably heard through the years. They sang the wreck of 97. A true train wreck there. I guess most of it's true. Right around Spencer, I believe. I'm not sure on that, but anyway, that's a line from it. The whole line of the song goes something similar to "Never speak harsh words, but he may leave and never return." So you never know when you say something harsh to someone, what's going to happen that day to completely change everything. And it starts off by saying, "Good sober railroad men awake early and arrive on time." But in 1951, their women do too. Different world, and that's what my friend Vicki was referring to when she said, it was a man's world. It was, it was the whole day was around. She was taking care of kids and everything. The whole day was getting him to the station, driving to the stations. Had one vehicle, old black Dodge pickup truck, and drive to the station, which was, for the kids, that was a great thing. Riding all the way down First Avenue. And this chapter starts right there, a little lane behind the Little Leaf Motel, close to the old mines. We used to walk up to Ruffner a good bit from there. And a lot of it is the drive from Huffman down old Highway 11 and what old Highway 11 was like as you went on down through Oklahoma. And they stopped at my mother's parents' house right across from Woodlawn, and then on down across the viaduct at the Sloss furnaces, and what the Sloss furnaces looked like in those days. And they had viewing places where you pull over in your vehicle that you could see the process there with the pig iron and
It smells too.
you can smell it all over town. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about smoke and fire all over town, and one of the things with the fire tower and everything. And later we lived kind of up on the hill. We could kind of see around Birmingham. In those days, there was you could see fire shooting up all over the city. Smoke with it, and a lot of times the smoke would be so thick that you could see the top of the buildings, like the City Federal, but you couldn't see the Comer building that time, I think, and you could not see the bottoms of them because of the smoke. It would settle overnight. But that's where that begins. And Huffman takes it to Woodlawn, takes him to the station, and it's a big day for my mother. Mentioned in there about Ruffner Tower. That's what Ruffner Tower looks like today. It's where all know the Rutherford Fire Tower. We used to walk up there as kids, and we used to talk about that. And again, we're tying into a little bit of the fire tower thing. Felicia. Casey Jones handled the throttle. Casey Jones, of course, the song was a famous engineer. I think Spike Jones did that song. And he runs into it a little bit on the day. The entire third chapter is at the Birmingham Terminal Station. And as they get ready to go out on the run. And the friends he meets just about the terminal station, about a day in the life of a railroad and a train and passengers. And the city of Birmingham was still making everything bustling in 1951. He arrives there early, getting there 2 or 3 hours. I remember we'd sometimes go and he would, you'd have to be there way ahead of time. So he gets to explore the terminal station. And he was there was a review done on this by Don Noble of the APR, does Alabama Public Television. He does those things on Alabama where he interviews people about books. And he did a review of this, which was real nice. And one of the things he mentioned about learning about Robert, the character here, was his gregariousness. And he was very, and as you go along in the book, you find out how that played in. Birmingham to Woodstock is basically the ride from Birmingham. Again, it's talking about the crescent here. It says that it's the crescent, that route now, New Orleans to New York, and it runs all through here, Birmingham, and to the Amtrak. But 1941 to 1970, it was called the Southerner. Originating in New York City and goes on down. But to this day, the crescent again was being detoured, so you had 247s going south, whereas most days you have one. At 1:55, the southbound second 47 backside of Terminal Station, backed out, hit south, went out through West End. Tries to describe all that very well. Fairfield, and then on down in Tuscaloosa at 2:01. Being Thanksgiving weekend, these trains were pretty busy, as you can imagine. And the train station was busy, like you were talking about on the clothes. It actually describes in there, it says how everybody was dressed up in hats and how people dressed back then. And different than we do today a lot. But this, don't know why I included that other than this. I had the Woodstock sign there for the trains at Woodstock, and it took on a different meaning. Bad news travels like wildfire. Good news travels slow. That chapter 5 and 6 is basically bad news travels like wildfire is chapter 5. Good news travels slow 6. And this is about to the end, but that chapter 5 is, they found out in Woodlawn, my mother and people, and I guess people everywhere found out quickly about the wreck, but getting details was another story. They couldn't get details because telephone lines with the Southern Railway, people like that were tied up. Getting down there was almost impossible within the old Bessemer Sugar Highway before the freeways because of people coming to see the wreck. I had somebody out of Wichita write me a letter and said that they were 3 or something years old and their parents wanted to take them to see the wreck, but they couldn't get there because of all the traffic of people. Basically, those days they weren't, we have everything now that we see that, that we see so quickly. In those days, to see a train wreck would have been, or something like that would have been, you couldn't go online and look at pictures like that or anything. It was a bit of thing to see. And of course, it took a while for the news to find out. So they went basically from Woodlawn in chapter 6, drove to Woodstock to see who's alive and who isn't. This is a control panel. I don't know exactly. Marvin Clemens sent this to me. And in the testimony, the dispatcher in Birmingham testifies that he's sitting in Birmingham. He notices that a white light come on over the north switch at Woodstock at 2:35 p.m. And he said he went to his supervisor and said something's wrong. And from there, they started getting calls and everything. But this right here is the wood. I don't really understand this panel. Marvin said it, but this right here is all these little things are where they have a sidetrack where one train pulls off, the other passes main line on down through all the way to Meridian on that end, Birmingham on this end. These are everywhere that you have a sidetrack. This one's Woodstock, and something similar to that is where the man saw the white light. The dispatcher saw the white light, and he testifies there. And when he got into testimony in 7, 8, 9, and 10, I'm not going to go into those. It's a pretty quick read. Don't want to go into that because if you do decide to read it, you know, there's a lot of things you need to decide for yourself. I don't make judgment calls on exactly, you know, it wasn't said, the spirit of the book was not, if someone told me you didn't set out to, you didn't have an axe to grind. And I did, not with my parents, not with people, you know, and all the railroad people that are mentioned here. I love those people that I've had enjoyed good memories of them. And it was not set out to do that. But so don't go into the very end or what happens after, but there are, you know, some kind of some twist of fate or whatever you want to call it, or divine intervention, or a lot of things combined in the book. This is the Woodstock. This is a few years ago at the Woodstock Methodist Community Church. Community Methodist Church in Woodstock, and I think it's 1893. And it was built. It's mentioned in some of the discussions that you hear from time to time that somebody was there when it happened. But that is kind of getting into just what people said now. But it's a pretty old church if you go down there now. It kind of sits up on the hill. The tracks being back this way, and there's no couple of antebellum homes. The station's not there, and there's been some things in the old store have changed a little, but it has not, that part of Woodstock right in there has not changed a whole lot. But there have been some changes from what it was then, but you can still see the old part of it, unlike the other part of Woodstock, which has changed. This is if you go down there today, this is actually 2022, looking northeast. Give you an idea, this is the side track that we're looking at on the little diagram there, the screen. This is the main line here. We're looking northeast towards Birmingham. Side track would be where 48 came up, had pulled off. First 47 went by, and then the crescent, second 47 was coming, and the 48's in this track pulls out. Well, there is where the accident occurred, and you see these posts up in here. That's where the trestle and all that we saw is right up in there. Maybe is right there. And like my brother and I talked about, we've always thought about it as kids and all those years and everything. We thought about, well, you can see it bends here went around the curve. The father's train came this way. When they came around the curve, the train was sitting here and or moving there, whatever in the book. But they did not have a lot of time to react. You can see there's not a lot of room up there, so they're coming around, and so there's somebody said there are some survivors, and some of them said in the transcripts, I made my own arrangements. I thought that was a funny statement. You know, you would make your arrangements and make them fast, and the crew would. Hopefully by this point of the wreck itself, a reader has gotten to know the crew, and on my father's train anyway, as well as somewhat testimony of the people on the other train. But and James Lowry with the railroad people over in Leeds, he told me, or somebody, no, it was someone else mentioned, is there a plaque there? I had never thought about that. It'd be hard to get to. The road is way back down here, but I don't know. But James Lowry does have a mineral sign down there, and doesn't really say much. We've all seen those. I don't know that In the old days, there was a dwarf signal when the northbound was looking at, it was 5 feet off the ground. That's what it looks like today. That's an eye level pretty much for the trains now. Much bigger. But it's still hard to tell what color it is. Is that one green or yellow, or can you see the light bulb burning in there? It's kind of hard to say. And this was sent by a man named Carl Ardrey, his father was kind of a famous Carlsville involved now with historical studies and all. Was conductor on the Crescent for years, and I didn't know him before this, but he read the book in the very early going and sent me this as a. This was taken on December 21st, 2021, which would be almost 70 years exactly after the wreck, and they're coming down. This is coming from Birmingham. This is the Crescent today. This is the main line, sidetrack. But it's a happier day. All's well that ends well, I guess, you know. And so I think we're about at the end there, Gary. And it is. And I thank you for letting me to do that. And you're so nice. I was going to tell you before we started, if I got to bore you, do this, you know. Somebody told me, tell them to do this. And if you're doing okay, tell them to do this. You know, but then one fellow said, well, if they start going to sleep, then that means you need to cut it short. But anyway, thank you very much for letting me do my little.
Very interesting. Enjoy.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Very proud of you.
Thank you.